Gentlemen, welcome to the Art of Fuel podcast with myself, Anthony Manuel. I'm joined today by Dr. Shawn Baker, who I'm really excited to have on. He's been the most requested nutrition guest on the show. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Dr. Shawn Baker, he is an orthopedic surgeon, international speaker, best-selling author of The Carnivore Diet, and world champion athlete. He's a leading authority on nutritional therapy and raising awareness about how it affects chronic diseases, and the CMO of Revero Health. His views extend beyond just how diet can influence health. His content inspires critical thinking about challenging topics like ecology, such as regenerative agriculture and the environmental impact of our consumption habits, ethics, and warns against censorship. Revero is a community platform helping people implement a carnivore-based elimination diet. They provide coaching, online group meetings, VIP forum, and the largest library of recipes, research articles, and success stories. They've recently succeeded in their goal of raising $5 million for their initial seed round. They're looking for a promising move forward in the right direction. And I'm really excited to be talking to you about your work with Revero, with how you've helped people reverse chronic disease, some of the just some of the awareness that you're raising about regenerative agriculture, and talking about how a carnivore lifestyle can really help people in terms of their health. So first of all, thanks for coming on the podcast, man. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Yeah, great. And thanks for having me. It's always nice to get to reach out to new audiences, and I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So for the people who might be unfamiliar with the carnivore way of living, I know there's a lot of confusion about the definitions of, say, carnivore and animal based, and ketovore. Just off the top of your head, in terms of your experience with the diet, the lifestyle, working with so many people, how do you define a carnivore diet, and what is the actual protocol as it relates to, like, if you're really authentically carnivore?
Yeah, I mean, so whether what you need to do to get healthy and what a carnivore diet may not be the same thing. And so if we're talking strict definitions here, a carnivore diet is basically animal products, basically only animal products. The only real exceptions to that are maybe a little bit of seasoning and maybe some people use like coffee and things like that. But generally, it's pretty much just meat, just eggs, plus or minus dairy. Some people include organ meats, but that's a strict definition. Now, again, I don't get dogmatic. I'm not pushing an ideology. I'm saying let's see what helps you. For some people, a strict, nothing but animal products diet is incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful, and many people do very well with that, either for a limited period of time or for extended periods of time. And so that's what that definition is. Now, what ultimately do you need to do to improve your health? It may be some version of that. I think animal products are not only not bad for you, but extremely healthy. And I think sort of liberally using them in your diet is generally a good idea.
Mm. And there's obviously a lot of. I don't want to dive too heavily into the arguments about saturated fat and cholesterol being related to heart disease, because I feel like you've covered that quite a bit. But in terms of some of the health outcomes that you've seen with people adopting this animal, like this animal product based nutritional protocol, what are some of the biggest health turnarounds that you've seen just from implementing that particular lifestyle intervention?
Yeah, well, I mean, we basically see the things that are most commonly get improved, and so we see a lot of obesity, we see a lot of mental health issues, we see a lot of digestive issues, and musculoskeletal issues. Those things predominate what most people have. Most people have arthritis. Many people are overweight. A lot of people have depression and anxiety, and a lot of people have digestive issues. And so those things routinely and very frequently improve. In addition to that, I mean, we see a lot of autoimmune issues that go away. Things like psoriasis has been particularly effective with this eczema, rheumatoid arthritis, the psoriatic arthritis. A lot of digestive issues like Crohn's disease and also colitis and IBS also seem to improve. I mean, people from the mental health side, I mean, obviously depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder,
Mm.
borderline personality disorder, Tourette's syndrome, even PTSD has seen improvement with this. So, I mean, it's really kind of, I don't want to call it a panacea, but it kind of is.
Mhm.
And I think when we look at chronic disease, most chronic diseases are impacted by nutrition. I think that's pretty clear. I think most people would understand that. And when your nutrition improves across the board, you generally see improvements. Now, some people completely get off all medications, completely reverse their diseases. Other people, kind of have less of a robust response. But it's been pretty rare where I haven't seen somebody go on this diet and see significant improvements in one or many areas.
Mm. The mental health one is very, very fascinating to me because I know someone personally who was on a vegan diet and then started implementing meat and reversed some chronic depression. I was vegan for 2 years as a lapse of personal judgment, for moral reasons, and experienced really like intense clinical depression, and it basically reversed itself within a couple of weeks of eating meat. And I was kind of curious, and I was following almost, a borderline carnivore diet because I'd experienced such intense leaky gut issues that I couldn't even eat vegetables, and I couldn't have any carbohydrate without, experiencing a tremendous amount of gastric distress. So, I didn't really think about it as a carnivore diet at the time, but I was basically just eating, ground beef, steak, and bone broth for over a month, and my mental health issues resolved themselves completely in that month. And I was kind of curious if you have any speculation in terms of the mechanics of why a person's mental health would experience so much better outcomes with the inclusion of meat in their diet. Do you think it's the exclusion of certain things, or the inclusion of extra meat, or maybe a little column A, little column B? Like
Yeah.
mechanically, what do you think is happening there?
Well, I mean, there's quite a bit of literature we can talk about that supports why meat and things in meat tend to be beneficial for mental health, and I do think it's a little bit of both. I think there's a pretty profound relationship between gut physiology and brain physiology. I mean, just like our brain is an organ, just like any other part of our body, and what affects one affects them all. And so we see perhaps with gut dysfunction, whether it's coming through dysbiosis or hyperpermeability, as you mentioned, kind of the so-called leaky gut, that does reflect in brain permeability. So we see
Mm,
leaky gut and then leaky blood-brain barrier. And so we see some of those things coming on. So that's going on for sure. I mean, we see some of the physiology with sort of dramatic energy swings. So when we're on more of a higher glucose, labile situation, which sometimes a higher carbohydrate diet can lead to that. Meat has a number of compounds that have been shown. In fact, there was a nice study out of Stanford in 2018 looking at relative carnitine deficiency.
mm,
So, as you may know, carnitine is pretty much only found in animal products. There's a very tiny amount in a couple plant items with it, but it's for the most part you're going to get it from animal products. And they showed that people with major depressive disorder had a significant sort of deficiency in carnitine. And it's something we internally synthesize, but we only can make so much. Much of it comes from our dietary intake. So
mm,
carnitine would be one candidate. I mean, we see also things like creatine. Creatine has been shown to improve cognition and mental health in general, as does carnosine. Again, these are all animal-based products. Taurine also has an impact
mm,
on brain physiology, which again you can't get in plant products. And then there's relative things, zinc and iron and things like that. Those are often, not always, but often associated with deficiencies in plant-based diets. So there are many things that are out there. And also, cholesterol. A
mm.
plant-based diet is devoid of cholesterol, and while our liver does make some of it, in fact most of it, you get more of it when you ingest it in a from your diet. And so all these things combined probably have a role. And there's probably literally hundreds of things that I'm not naming that also have an impact. We know that, like, for instance, it's been shown that beef has something like 50,000 individual nutrients, only
Mm.
about 10% of which are found in plants. And so we only know what, a few dozen of them actually do. The other thousands of them, we have no idea what they do. And, so when you eliminate that, we don't even know what we're eliminating, quite honestly.
Right. And it's so it sounds like there's obvious nutrient specific deficiencies, maybe some gut dysbiosis that you're talking about from eating too much, maybe fiber and lectin heavy legumes that a Michael Greger style diet might induce
Yeah.
on a person basically. And that was 100% my experience. um, in terms of the low carb aspect, because this is something that's kind of relatively new in the carnivore sort of realm, is this idea of an animal based diet. And I think I heard you talking to someone on a podcast recently about some people who are maybe adopting the ideas of ray peat, and they're starting to add literal sucrose to their diet. So maybe they're eating relatively meat based, and they're eating sucrose. What's your take on the utilization of carbohydrate on these animal-based diets, and what do you think they're getting right? What do you think they're getting wrong?
Well, I think, it's going to be individual to a degree. I think if you're metabolically healthy, and a lot of people, what we'll see is, they're either very healthy to start with, or they get very healthy on a meat-based diet. They eliminate everything, they lose weight, they get lean, they improve their overall health. And then they find they're able to tolerate some of these things in the setting of exercise and, that type of situation. So that's very different than a person who comes to you who's pre-diabetic, diabetic, obese, and then you say, let's just keep shoving in a bunch of sugar in there. I think that, you know, certainly humans have demonstrated to be omnivorous. I mean, we're clear. I've never sort of challenged that. I think we tend to be facultative carnivores, which means we do better on meat, but we certainly can be, omnivorous. And in nature, a carnivore is anything that eats meat, and there's different percentages. Hypercarnivores are defined as 70% or more of your calories coming from meat. And
Mhm.
and so I think that one of the things that people sometimes get into trouble with adding, whether it's fruit or honey or table sugar or Mexican Coca-Cola, some of them advocate, is that, for some people that they just, I mean, there is such an overlying psychological aspect to why many of us eat, and that sort of kind of dredges that up, and these people get on this sort of slippery slope where, it's a little bit, and then it becomes a massive amount, and then all of a sudden they find themselves back to where they were. A huge swath of the population, both here in the U.S. and Canada, is either diabetic, pre-diabetic, or at least hyperinsulinemic, and so those things again can continue to drive that pathology. Additionally, there are still sensitivities that people have, and I mean, just because one guy can sit there and chow down on bowls of strawberries and blueberries and honey doesn't mean you may be able to do that. That's one of the things with our company. We're using AI to sort of figure out what diseases go with what sort of other foods. And I think
Mm.
that's important to realize. I think meat is a pretty safe food for most people, I mean, just from pure physiologic standpoint. Now, there's some people that through time, through age, through disease, through the use of things like proton pump inhibitors, and they decrease their acid producing capacity, they have a hard time digesting it. And then some people have ethical issues and cultural issues. But I think, if we were to take a blank slate and take some young, healthy kids and put them on meat, they're not going to have problems for the most part because it kind of develops later in life. But some of these other foods, whether it's certain types of wheat or certain, fruits, vegetables, and certainly the processed food that we're all exposed to,
Mm.
I think we have variable tolerances to that. And that may be like, for instance, milk is a great one, lactose. Some people are lactose
Mhm.
intolerant, some people aren't. And that's just one of those things that's developed. I mean, we weren't exposed to lactose in any significant amount until about, 10, 12,000 years ago when we started domesticating some of these animals, cattle and sheep and things like that. And so that has sort of filtered its way through uh, different cultures. And, some people were exposed to where grain was first evolved in the kind of the breadbasket of humanity in the Middle East. They may have a greater tolerance to that than somebody who maybe uh, grew up in Scandinavia or some Northern
Right.
Europe where, that this wasn't something you could reliably get. So yeah, I think the belief, I mean, one of the beliefs is that if you don't consume carbohydrates or sugar, you're going to have this situation with elevated cortisol levels.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, I was
what
gonna
that's
ask about
based
that.
on, yeah, what that's really based on is there are some short-term studies looking at low carbohydrate diets where cortisol does indeed go up. And part of that is because cortisol is one of our kind of regulatory hormones, so it helps to increase our glucose levels. Insulin stores everything, and glucagon, cortisol, and adrenaline, norepinephrine tend to do the opposite. And so when you restrict carbohydrates, the counter regulatory hormones go up a little bit to make sure to ensure that you have adequate glucose. But it's been shown, in fact, there's a recent study by I think Joseph Whitaker just did this study, showed that basically that effect lasts about 3 weeks, and then it kind of
Okay.
normalizes. So
So
it's
a so
such a
after 3 weeks, you kinda
yeah, I
reach
mean,
that baseline
based
level of
yeah, based on
cortisol.
study, and that's what we see. Like, I've had people that have been on carnivore diets for a long time. You assess their cortisol levels, and they're normal. Or, and there's thoughts on too low of cortisol being a problem, that not being able to produce a cortisol response. Because remember, we never want anything to be zero. I mean, this is a
Mm.
whole thing. That's one of the problems with the low carb community. they think glucose of zero, or low as possible, and insulin low as possible is the right thing. Well, that's not true either. There's always, there's reasons things go up and down. We all, if it was bad for us, our body wouldn't make it, basically. Same thing with cholesterol things, same thing with glucose. We need that stuff. It's part of our
Mhm.
physiology. And to sort of, tie it to one particular disease state and then say, oh my God, it's one of those things. If a little's good, more is better. Or if a
Mm.
little is bad, then zero must be the answer. And usually the truth is, not, it lies in between.
Well, there's even the phenomenon of gluconeogenesis when you eat a certain amount of protein from meat as well, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, gluconeogenesis is always occurring, and you can make glucose from basically any macronutrient. You can turn protein into glucose, you can turn fat into glucose, and of course,
Mm.
carbohydrates are converted to glucose. And when you eat, a lot of it can be just glucagon. There's a release of
Mm.
glucagon. Protein stimulates glucagon and insulin release. And so glucagon is going to act on the liver to break down the glycogen in your liver. So you have glycogenolysis going on, and that can
Mm.
occur pretty rapidly. Like, for instance, exercise. Intense exercise can increase our rate of uh, liver production of glucose, uh, 1,500%, 1,500%
Mm.
element. So you can massively produce glucose when you need it. And so gluconeogenesis is definitely occurring. I mean, you can't avoid it when you go to bed at night. And that's where your glucose is largely coming from. It's kind of a slower process, and so I don't, I think that because there's some studies looking at protein consumption, for instance, and you'll see a peak in glucose occurring when protein consumption exceeds about 75 grams in one sitting.
Okay.
And I think that's probably related to glucagon most, quite honestly, because the way like a steak is digested, I mean, it spends 4 hours in your stomach, and then it's going to spend, depending on who you read, 12 to maybe 48 hours winding its way through your intestines while it slowly picks apart and dissolves all the peptides and, absorbs all the amino acids, which are then converted to, obviously there's structural uses for protein. And it's not just muscle, by the way. It's muscle, it's bone, it's skin, it's
Mhm.
it's, it's nerves, it's neurotransmitters, it's hormones, it's the immune system. So protein has much more utilization. That's why one of the misconceptions about you can only consume 30 grams of protein at a time, otherwise it'll be weight. Well, that's not the truth.
Mm.
30 to 50 will go to muscle protein synthesis, but the rest of it's still being utilized. And again, these are all mostly studies done on whey proteins or other some kind of protein isolate, which has got a very different absorption
Right.
characteristic than say a steak does.
Mhm. And that's you're obviously a high level athlete, and you're a world record holder, I think, in indoor rowing, right? And you've competed at a high level at Highland
Yeah,
Games as well.
yeah.
And so, and one of the questions that I kept getting is, does Sean eat any carbohydrates to perform at these high levels? Because a lot of the activities, like high level rowing, that's extremely glycolytic. That's super super high output anaerobic, and similar strength. You're watching you do deadlifts and these heavy med ball tosses when you're working out and everything. This is all glycolytic activity, and the question I keep getting is like, how do you support that without the consumption of carbohydrate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, yeah, clearly it's glycolytic. I mean, there's a point of, and it changes. My threshold for switching over to glycolytic is probably a little higher than other people. So that is to say, probably at the lower level exercise, I'm still burning more fat than somebody else that might already be switched into the glycolytic system.
Hmm.
Um, I don't have zero glycogen in my muscle. I mean, like I said, protein, we have this gluconeogenesis going on, and you get very efficient at it over time. So overnight, I'm eating, gosh, 400 grams of protein a day. I mean, and so that is eventually, particularly overnight, is refilling my muscle glycogen stores, my liver glycogen stores. We know that from human and animal studies that occurs. Again, it becomes more efficient as stay away from carbohydrates. So I don't use carbohydrates for performance. I mean, there's various reasons why I choose not to, but the bottom line is, for what I do, indoor rowing, world records, Highland Games, strength, deadlifting, that's all very short duration. You think about it, even a hard set of 20 rep deadlifts is going to take you maybe a minute,
Hmm.
maybe 90 seconds at most. Same with some of the rowing stuff. And I've rowed for an hour or more. I've done that stuff. But I think where you get into issues is maybe if you're doing a marathon, I've got zero desire to do that. Maybe if you're doing CrossFit, but you're doing multiple workouts throughout the day,
Hmm.
then you may struggle. But for what I do, I don't have any trouble at all with performance. I can do, I mean, I can literally do, some sort of sprinting workout in the morning, and then maybe a weightlifting session in the afternoon, and then go to jujitsu at night, all without carbohydrates,
Hmm.
and perform at a very high level. And like I said, um, part of it was, I mean, as a carnivore athlete, this is when I broke all these rowing world records. But I mean, I've always been an athlete. I mean, I trained when I was eating an omnivorous, everything in sight diet. I set powerlifting records. I set track and field, well, all American status in track and field. I won Highland Game World Championships doing that. So I mean, I've always been a high level athlete. But I will say that when I went from say age 45 to age 50, for me, I noticed a significant improvement in my performance, my recovery. My strength to weight ratio by going carnivore relative to omnivorous. So I did see an improvement in my particular case.
And do you think the improvement in performance was just tuning your body to have a greater efficiency in producing its own glucose, running on fat, maybe lower inflammation? That's one thing that I noticed too was cutting. I'm not 100% strict carnivore, but cutting out a lot of foods that are, you know, quite inflammatory and difficult to digest and high in fiber. Like I ate very little fiber compared to what I used to. And I just noticed like, again, same thing, huge spike in performance. What do you think the going from omnivorous to carnivore, where do you think that performance uptick
Yeah,
came from?
so I think when we look at the studies and they just look at pure output, and energy, energy dynamics. That if you do a study, like say you do a series of Wingate tests, where you get in there and just all out 30 seconds, and I'm doing a bunch of those right now for fun. It's
For
I'm saying
fun.
that in quotes, but that's for my training is a lot of Wingate type tests right now. But when you look at that and you load some with carbohydrates, they're going to have maybe a little bit higher uh, peak wattage. During that period of time, 5% different or something like that. And for the one individual event, it may have a difference. But if you look at the entirety of a training, like I'll use like a fighter, for instance, they may spend their camp maybe 3 4 months, and they're training the whole time. And what ultimately results in the performance is a cumulative effect of every single day you did. And what I found, and maybe it's just because I'm older, I've got too many, I've rode my body pretty hard over the years, and so I've got a lot of just things that if my diet falls off, yeah, my knee hurts, my back hurts, I don't have the energy, and I'm inflamed, and so what I found is one, I don't have as much inflammation, so I recover much better. I feel good all the time or most of the time, and so I'm just more willing to train. The other thing I found is that look, I mean, when we're eating, what is the point of eating? Was to provide nutrition to our bodies so that we can restore and build things and maintain things. And meat is just so efficient. I mean, when you're eating a bunch of vegetables, I mean, the fiber is interfering with the absorption of the other nutrients, the minerals, some of the protein, some of the other macronutrients. And so it's just more efficient. So you get this great, tremendous efficiency of building materials coming into your body. You have lower inflammation, better recovery, better sleep is what I've found. That all adds up. And so maybe that small performance advantage you get by eating the carbohydrates, at least in my case, is negated by more inflammation. Like I said, I don't want to train when my back hurts or my knee hurts. So I'm not
Mm.
going to train as hard or I'm not going to train at all, and that's going to add up over time. And so maybe for an individual performance, and this may be a strategy that some people want to employ, is most of the time they train in a carnivorous state or a low carb state, and then just for one selected event they'll add a little carbohydrate in to get that little bit of booster in that performance, and then they go back to training like they usually have, and that seems to work pretty well as all for many people. But I know, like from gut physiology, if you look at, let's just assume glucose is that fuel that's going to give you that little bit of extra benefit. Well, we know that, like you slug a big Gatorade, 20 minutes before you perform, you're going to get a big glucose spike. Blood glucose may be 180 milligrams per deciliter, 140 or something like that. We're normally at 70 or 80. Uh, you don't get that effect by eating a steak. You don't get that immediate effect. But what you do get about 3 to 5 hours afterwards is a relative rise. And so you can kind of time it. So like when I won the rowing world championships a couple years back, I remember I was in California, and They were being held in Long Beach, so it was something that I could make without having to fly across the world. And I was literally not even an hour away from there. So I literally ate like a 3 pound tomahawk steak like 4 hours before I was supposed to row. I ate that, and then I drove up there, registered and hopped on a rowing machine and won the world championships. And I assume had I had checked my blood glucose, it probably would have been the highest it had been that day, all day long, just on that. So you can time it. The other thing that with performance, one of the nice things about carbohydrates is it hydrates you.
Mm,
There's this relationship between glycogen and water. But the other thing is that insulin tends to make you retain fluid, retain salt, retain water. And when you eliminate that, or not eliminate, but when you dramatically drop that, a lot of people end up being relatively dehydrated. So I just basically, just basically take fluid and salt or electrolyte in before I compete. That
mm.
also has a beneficial effect.
I heard a really interesting theory about why some of the carnivore people who were zero carb for a while switched out to saying that they needed carbohydrate was because they were consuming so many organs that were super high in copper, super high in these other minerals, and they end up causing this mineral imbalance that affects their hydration. And so they think that they need this insulin to start hydrating themselves from carbohydrate again. Basically, they're like, oh, I'm not hydrating myself. I'm developing electrolyte imbalances. Do you think an overconsumption and this huge emphasis on organ consumption is actually shooting people in the foot on a carnivore diet?
I mean, it certainly could be. I mean, I can't say for sure. I know that, like I said, I'm a physician. I try to be scientific, but there's a point where there's people that have done this experiment. In fact, the people that I sort of learned this from had been doing this for 10 years, 20 years, and they what they would say is, look, the organ meats are, you can eat them if you want them. They're not necessary. They're clearly
Mm,
not necessary. And what they would see is people would do that. They would get all excited and eat all the organs, and then about 6 months, a year later, they would just stop. You'd never see them again, because what happens is, and so maybe that's occurring. I don't know. I mean, it could be. It'd be interesting to see. My take on that is, if you want them, you can eat them. I mean, the data I have, I've got data on 12,000 people that did a carnivore diet.
mm,
Only about 15% regularly consumed organ meats, and there was no difference in their outcomes as far as, reversal of disease, getting off medications, feeling better. Zero difference. In fact, Harvard University study, they looked at the same topic. They write in the body of the text, we saw no difference in outcomes with regard to deficiencies or any other issues, whether you consumed organs or not. So they're not, in my view, they're not necessary. And there are some people that are sort of push that narrative, and some of them have a conflict of interest with selling supplements in
yeah.
that regard. And so I just say, look, it's something that I don't feel you have to do. If you like them and they benefit you, go ahead. But yeah, I could see where, there's sort of, I mean, you think about it, and no one knows for sure. Really, no one knows for sure. I mean, we've got some modern examples of hunter gatherers that are living really subsistence lifestyles. I mean, these people are not, they don't have these big, giant megafaunal animals to eat anymore like we did
Hmm.
clearly 50, 100,000 years ago. And so they're, you look at the Hadza, a lot of people like to use the Hadza as models for microbiome health and so on, but they're running around chasing baboons.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not primo food. I mean, that's the bottom of the barrel basically. And so of course they're going to eat every part of that animal just because that's all they got. And some of these people that are advocating organ consumption in a way that's not even consistent with animal anatomy. I mean, they're eating more liver
Mm,
than there is in an animal. I mean, like I said, if you distribute, even, if you ate an animal nose to tail, organ meats would still be a tiny, tiny part of that. And then you have to realize that anyone that's ever been hunting, when you gut an animal, those organs don't last very long. I mean, they're going to go
mm,
bad very rapidly. Whereas the meat, will just last longer. You can preserve it, you can eat it. And this is what humans did. I mean, clearly we know that humans would kill big animals and they would cut them up, they would dry them in the sun. They would either stick them in the snow if they're in a cold environment, or they even stored them underwater. And those were all well known and well accepted ways to preserve meat that did that. So the organs would probably have been a small percentage of that. And so when you're eating in a subsistence situation, it's very different than you're eating in a surplus situation. I think early humans, again, I don't have a time machine, but I mean, the evidence seems to point to that we were living in much of the case in a surplus situation. And so your choices, it's just like anybody, when the fridge is full, you eat what you like, right? When then you kind
Right.
of you go, oh, I'm hungry. There's only left. I'll eat this, kind of nasty thing I don't really like. And I think that's the same thing. I mean, there, for some of us find, in fact, many people find that a lot of these organ meats are not particularly palatable, and
Yeah.
maybe there's a reason for that.
It kind of makes sense. The one argument that I found kind of difficult when you're saying it's like, oh, well, the things that are palatable are evolutionarily kind of what we're geared towards
Sure.
seeking out, right? The sugar thing kind of shoots us in the foot. Obviously, hyper palatable foods become like a major issue,
Right,
and
right.
it's difficult. But when you look at some of the anthropological data and you're seeing how humans prioritized the meat and associated fat of these megafaunal animals, it's there's not a lot of anthropological data to say that we ate a ton of liver, and there's probably a reason that it doesn't taste very good. And that's you can do with that speculation. Again, like you said, we don't have a time machine, so we don't know what our ancestors were eating necessarily. But I did want to ask about fat content, because this is a pretty common topic that's being talked about right now, is this idea of saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fatty acids, right? And I would assume that obviously grass-fed ruminant animals really high in saturated fats. Animals that are grain-fed like pigs and chicken and commercially raised cows are a little bit higher in polyunsaturated fatty acids. People are talking about how inflammatory PUFAs are. Do you think that's a major concern in terms of health outcomes and even performance outcomes, or is that something that you worry about a little bit less?
Well, I think, again, these are all things, it's always, people want to put, the problem somewhere. Is it sugar? Is it seed oils? Is it saturated fat? I mean, and I think what we have to realize is it's probably none of those in context. I mean, it's food. I mean, we're eating food. No one just goes down and eats a bowl of saturated fat, or hopefully no one's out there drinking gallons of canola oil, or no one's in there in eating raw sugar out of the cabinet. So I think those things we just have to realize you have to put it in context. And so when I look at like let's say for instance you wanted to blame soybean oil for the woes of society, and I think an argument can be made. I mean, certainly uh, I don't care what you think we were eating 1,000 years ago. It wasn't soybean oil. It didn't exist, right? So we know some of these things are new to the human existence and human diet. So you could say, well, if it's a novel food, and we've got all these new diseases, or at least a higher prevalence of these chronic diseases, it's a likely candidate. But is a problem that it's a seed oil, or is it the problem that what are seed oils in? And you look at where do most people consume these things? Highly processed, kind of junk food. It's just devoid of nutrition. It's high in calories, low in nutrition, and this may be that. It may be the representation of that. I know there's people who talk, well, it's extracted from hexane, and maybe that's inflammatory. And I mean, I think all those things can be true. Um, you know, I don't consume them. I mean, I'm eating a meat-based diet. I'm not going to get canola oil in my diet, really. Um, and again, we also have to realize, when we talk about saturated fat is not just one entity. It's,
Hmm.
like for instance, most people don't realize beef is higher in monounsaturated fat than saturated fat. And as you get into the better marbled stuff, the ratio goes up even higher, more to monounsaturated fat. So, it's something that has a lot more nuance, and then saturated fat itself. I mean, which saturated? You're talking about stearic acid, oleic acid, palmitic acid. You talk about the short chain, the medium chain fatty acids. I mean, there's all kinds of nuance here, and so when you paint everything with a broad brush, you get into trouble. And I think it's unfortunately we don't have a lot of studies on people just eating meat. We've got some now; they're starting to come out. And this is the thing I would say is there may be a dozen papers, scientific papers on a carnivore diet that I'm aware of, and I've looked pretty hard. Every one of them, 100% show good results. So, I mean, if you're like trying to make an assumption, you would say, well, maybe that should be our hypothesis, because all the research papers on a carnivore diet show good results, show disease reversal, good health, low side effects, people losing, whatever metric you want to put in there, people generally get better. But people would rather use an epidemiologic study of people eating, for instance, the United States, how much beef do we eat per year? on average about a little over 2 ounces. 2 ounces of food a day is
Mm,
a tiny amount.
yeah.
It's a teeny tiny amount of our overall daily caloric consumption. And then you look at, where does the bulk of our calories come from? It comes from highly processed, junk food. It's like 60% of our calories. And so why would you blame beef, which is only 2 ounces, for something that, probably it's coming from this junk food? And whether it's polyunsaturated fats or seed oils, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they have a deleterious effect for people. Again, I have a hard time saying that's that's the one thing. If we just avoided that, everything would be great, because probably that's not the truth.
That yeah, I mean, when you're trying to be that reductionistic about something as complex as nutrition and then applying that to something even more complex as health, right? That there's too many variables to ascribe one particular thing as the cause of all evil. I had a viewer question here. They were asking specifically how to deal with gallbladder issues from a high fat animal based diet. If they have a gallbladder issue, can they still follow an animal based protocol where most of your calories for energy specifically are coming from fat?
Yeah, and that's a good point. A lot of people think it's a high protein diet, or it's an all protein diet, and really it's mostly fat. I mean, even at the leanest, I eat probably minimum 40 or 50% of my calories are coming from fat, and so, like, on a day-to-day basis, I'm usually consuming 60, maybe 70% of my calories from fat. So you do have that issue. And I think there's two issues. One, there's people that don't have a gallbladder, they've already had it removed. And what we see is, the nice thing is that we still produce bile, and actually the common bile duct actually expands to accommodate a little bit more. It has a little bit expansion, so it holds a little bit of it acts as kind of like a pseudo gallbladder. And so when you stimulate
Mm,
cholecystokinin, and the sphincter vodi releases through the ampulla of Vater, and we get this bolus of bile that drops in to help us emulsify the fat. So that's still occurring. Now, if you have a hot gallbladder, you got a gallbladder that's filled with sludge or gallstones or something like that, yes, stimulating it to contract with fat is going to cause pain potentially. And, you know, how do you deal with that? I mean, what is causing it to do that in the first place? Probably it was the junk food diet that you're on, and maybe the sort of akinesis, or the failure to contract because you weren't eating enough fat all along, and you're eating this low fat, artificial, you know, gluten free, cardboard stuff, and your gallbladder just sat there and it never contracted, and you had all this, this sort of solubilized cholesterol, or other material. And now it's just been sitting there and pooling, and now it's kind of precipitated out. And what you should have been doing all along with regular fat, so your gallbladder is contracting on a regular basis to clear that stuff out. But it is what it is now. And so, what can you do? There are agents that you can take to help dissolve that stuff. There's one called ursodiol, and there's a few others out there on the market. May take a while, may take 6 months, may take a year. In the
mm,
meantime, what I would do is, kind of limit how much fat I get in any one particular meal. So it might mean that instead of eating like two big meals a day like I do, which is convenient for me, you might have to eat smaller meals with less total fat per meal.
mm.
So you can kind of minimize the symptoms of that, and then hopefully the gallbladder will recover. You might take some medications to dissolve that stuff. Or what happens to some people is they just get it removed. I mean, and
Right.
and once it's removed, you can continue to go on. You might have to moderate how much fat you take initially, smaller dosages, and then kind of go with time to build up from that.
Do you think supplements like ox bile would be particularly useful, or do you think taking an exogenous bile wouldn't do much for your digestion?
I think the potential problems with that are, I don't know that it's a bile deficiency for most people. For
Mm,
maybe a small percentage of people, it's an issue and it might be helpful. But I think for most people, what they do is they just take in this box bile, and it runs right through them, and they have this bile acid malabsorption syndrome, and they just end up with diarrhea. And so I think it's, maybe worth testing, but if you don't absorb it, it's a waste of money. And so I think probably more efficacious is something like a lipase or pancreatic enzyme,
mm.
supplement, because that's something that's not going to, be malabsorbed most likely. So those things probably have more efficacy from what I've seen.
Right. So we have another viewer question here. Have you ever experienced any clients who have resolved GERD, and if they still experience GERD after making switch to a carnivorous diet, is there a more specific protocol that they
Yeah.
can have to help resolve that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So GERD or gastroesophageal reflux disease is, a system where a problem where stomach acid goes up in your esophagus and maybe into your mouth and stuff like that. It can be associated with coughing or voice changes or just burning, burning sensation, and that's a problem. And typically, how it's treated is we just suppress the acid. We chew up antacids or we take proton pump inhibitors, which is a wrong way to treat this because what happens is it just makes you less efficient at digestion and you can't digest your food, and then you get all these deficiencies, and then you end up with bone issues, and on and on and on. And so, why is the acid ending up in the esophagus? It's not the problem that you have acid. Acid is actually good. We need it. We make it. Our body expends a tremendous amount of energy to make that acid for reasons. It's because it supports our digestion. But why is it ending up in the esophagus? Well, it's ending up in the esophagus typically due to pressure. Where is that pressure coming from? The pressure is often coming from just either you ate so much that you just filled your stomach up, which is pretty uncommon, but more often than not, it's just air. It's just air pressure from
Mm-hmm.
gas being elicited from things that are highly fermentable, fibers, some sugars, things like that. And so that causes your guts to blow up. If anybody, you've had distension or gas after a certain meal, maybe a big old salad, all of a sudden your guts blow up. Well, that pressure goes both up and down. So it'll go out the back end, but it can push out the front end, and it basically blows that lower esophageal sphincter valve that sits at the top of your stomach between that and your esophagus. And once that valve is blown open, the food contents and acid go back up in your esophagus. So generally, removing fibers and all these other sort of highly fermentable foods helps with that. Sometimes people on a carnivore diet will still develop that. And usually, what I've seen is it's usually too high of a fat content, similar with the gallbladder, and they end up still having some bloating and nausea, and that gas is causing the reflux. And so, generally, once again, limiting the amount of fat per meal. So you may still need, like, let's just say your minimum requirement for fat is 150 grams a day, which is pretty typical on a carnivore diet. You may only be able to tolerate 50 grams at one sitting without getting the reflux. So then that means you just basically have to break it up into 3 meals. And so that's how we typically approach that. Rendered fats can sometimes have issues for people with bloating. And so rendered fats would be cooked down bacon grease or ground beef, stuff like that, or lots of butters and creams and just concentrated liquid fats. So if you can avoid that or minimize that in that situation, that can be beneficial.
So focusing more on whole food fats from, say, like whole
Yeah,
steaks
so
or
like you get a,
normal.
you get like a marbled steak, or you get a steak, a little brisket with some fat on it, and just that's
Mhm.
where you get your fat from. And it's going to be a little. It's still kind of semi-solid, so it's going to take longer to break down and digest, and so it won't cause the GI disturbances as much.
Right, doesn't hit your system all at once. Last audience question here. Assuming the person has a healthy metabolism, do you think it's appropriate for someone who doesn't want to be on the carnivore diet long term to include some sort of plant foods maybe once a week so that they don't develop like sensitivities to specific foods? Like, is there? I'm going to phrase it as like, do you think there's either a positive hormetic effect or do you think there's a positive microbiome effect from including the occasional foods if a person doesn't want to be super strict long term?
Sure, sure. I think there's no wrong. I mean, I think like a a meat diet, a meat-based diet in no junk food and other food is fine for a lot of people. I think, meat plus fruit or meat plus fruit and some vegetables or some other whole food is a great diet for a lot of people. There's nothing wrong with that. Just because I choose not to do that or I help people that don't do that doesn't mean it can't be the right thing for you. I think more than anything, just realizing that meat is a health food, the more we eat of it, probably the better we're going to do in most cases. And so those other things it can make it more sustainable. It can make it more palatable. Hey, I use spices on my food just to give it a little more variety, and it doesn't seem to bother me. But that's a caveat. You want to be objective about it and see what. I mean, sure, I'd like to eat chocolate cake every day, but I mean, it's not good for me. I mean, objectively, it's not good for me. And so,
Mm.
I would say, if it's going to be something that's going to keep you on a mostly meat-based diet, assuming that's working for you, then that's fine. I think there's nothing wrong with high quality protein, high quality fats, very good digestibility, all make for, if you do a 90% carnivore diet or 70 or 80, the data we had, so we had data on, people doing a diet from 70% up to 100%. And we saw, the difference between 90 and 100% wasn't that great, for the
Mm,
for the average person. The difference between 70 and 80 was pretty decent. From 80 to 90 it was still good, but not as much. And then from 90 to 100 it was, 5% difference. Now, within that subset, there's people with severe autoimmune issues where that was significant. So that didn't make it there. But for the average person, maybe they just, they're generally doing good. Maybe they got a little bit of weight to lose, going 80, 90% carnivore is generally going to be helpful for those people. And then they just have to see what that 80%, what that 20% or that 10% um, consists of that actually is not harmful to them.
and that was the study that you guys did with Harvard recently, wasn't it?
Uh, so
Or
Harvard did a survey study on 2,000 people doing a carnivore diet.
nice.
And when you look at the food frequency, I mean, it was basically 95% all meat for the most part. I mean, there were some eggs and a little bit of dairy in there, but it was
Yeah.
95% animal products. Some people were 100%. It ranged from 6 months to up to 28 years. People were doing this, and so we had a wide range of people doing that. And yeah, it just showed good outcomes across the board.
Do you find there are certain factors that determine whether or not a person is successful long term, not in terms of like the health outcomes, but in terms of adherence
Yeah.
long term to a carnivore diet? Is there a difference in psychological profile or health profiles? Like what's the difference in the people that stick with it long term?
Well, I think there's a couple aspects that are going to predict success, and one is um, getting some level of benefit early on. So noting some improvement.
Hmm.
Two is just a mental buy-in. You got to believe, like anything. There's a mental side of this thing. If you don't think something's going to work, it probably isn't going to work. So you have to sort of do that. And then I think support, having a supportive environment, whether it's from your family, your friends, your work environment, your physicians, or an online community, which is what we provide,
Mhm.
has been very, very much a predictor for success. Even in our survey, we asked, family and physician support or no support, and the people that answered support had about a 25% likelihood increase for being successful, and the people that didn't have support, 25% less likely to be successful, which is significant. I think, you know, in my experience, having someone that can kind of guide you a little bit has been helpful just because, there's people that will just sit there and they'll just, okay, I'm gonna do a carnivore diet. I'm gonna eat just plain old ground beef for the next 10 years. They sit down and then you do that for 3 or 4 days. And like, this sucks. I'm not doing it. And, and I wouldn't do it either. I mean,
Mm,
I talk to people. And the other thing is, I think realizing, and this is actually a very important part. Why are you, assuming this is a health related reason, which is why most people do this. No one that's in great health, feels good, is going to restrict their diet. I mean, they're not going to. Why would you?
mm.
This doesn't make sense. So most of what we're seeing is people that have some issue with their health. Maybe it's obesity, maybe it's diabetes, maybe it's food addiction, but almost all of them have this kind of uh, sort of, I would call it normal but pathological relationship with food. That is to say, we're not eating because we're hungry or we need nutrition. We're eating because we're bored, we're stressed out, because we're watching TV, because it's 5 o'clock and you're supposed to eat now. And I mean, there's so many reasons we eat that aren't nutritive. And so, I mean, just figuring out to sort of redefine your relationship for food, to eat because you require nutrition. That's not to say you can't enjoy it. I can tell you very much, just before we did this podcast, I ate a bison ribeye and a New York strip, prime grade New York strip, and I loved it. It was incredible. I was just, I'm loving my food. I really enjoy it. But, at the same time, some people would say, well, that's a restrictive diet or something like that.
Mm,
But so figuring out how to change that and going from, um, I can't walk through a room that has a plate of cookies on the counter without taking one, or
right.
or if I'm hungry, God forbid I'm hungry and there's a plate of cookies in the room, then that thing's going to be demolished, right? And I
Mhm.
did that. I mean, I remember as a surgeon, I'd walk through the break room, somebody bringing a big old box of Krispy Kreme donuts. It's crap, but you walk through there 3 or 4 times, you start getting hungry, and it's like, oh well, shit, I'm just gonna have one. And then all of a sudden that one turns into six, and you're like, oh, what did I do? And you never feel good about it. But breaking away from that sort of situation and understanding that you need to do that. It's not that you can never have a Krispy Kreme donut or a piece of cake or a piece of dark chocolate the rest of your life, but you've got to be able to sort of, realize that the food is driving your behavior. And there's people that'll, remember there's a little commercial. What would you do for a Klondike bar? Yeah, and some people, well, I'd scale them out, because because they're literally addicted to this stuff,
Mm,
and so you've got to get away from that mindset that, hell, I don't need that shit. But, not to think that I'm going to be a monk the rest of my life and never
mm,
eat anything else. So if you can kind of come to terms with that and just get on a generally healthy pattern and say 95% of the time you're eating a good diet, once in a while you go off it, you realize it, and you just take it for what it is, and you get right back to the grind. It's like working out. I mean, sometimes we train and we have some really good training sessions, and every once in a while we just, we don't do, we just
no
gotta
one
take some
into it.
time
Yeah.
off. Yeah.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, Dr. Baker, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today. I learned a lot actually, and I'm someone who spends a ton of time researching this stuff anyway. I've read your book like 3 times and I've watched every new video that you've been putting out. You can find all your work on YouTube right now by searching Shawn Baker. You're on Instagram at Shawn Baker 1967. There's Carnivore Diet is the platform that you have, right? So if you actually type in like the actual URL instead of .com is Carnivore Diet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so we've kind of got Revero.com, which we are going to be, that's going to be our full medical platform, which we raised the investment dollars for. That's going to be full service medical. So if you want a physician, it's going to be
Mm.
de-prescribing medications and all that stuff. Carnivore Diet is for people interested in a carnivore diet and want the community there. So both things are going to be running simultaneously, but one is going to be provide that full service medical, which is what Rivera will be doing. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was the Art of Fuel podcast. If you guys are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify or iTunes, leave a review. Let me know how you liked it. And you can follow me at The Body Moves on Instagram. Follow the other podcast account at The Art of Move, and then follow Shawn at Shawn Baker 1967. Thank you so much, Shawn. This was great.
I appreciate it. Thank you.